With the Jewish community observing Passover this week and Christians celebrating Easter and footy this weekend, let's have a look at the state of religion in America.
America is still a very religious country. Many of the first European settlers were fleeing religious persecution, and while the founders wanted to make sure that there was no official state religion, America they wanted to see as a nation under God. 69% of Americans say that they're very religious or moderately religious. Just 31% say they seldom or never go to a place of worship. 78% of Americans say they're Christians. The number of Protestants has been falling but still represents 51%, and of those, about half are members of evangelical churches. 24% of Americans are Catholics. Just under 2% are Mormons, and there are a similar number of Jewish Americans. Less than 1% of Americans are Muslim, Hindu or Buddhist, and just 1.6% of Americans say they're an atheist. African Americans are the most likely to be religious, and more women go to religious services than men. There are more Protestants and evangelicals in the southern states, more Catholics up in the northeast. The Midwest is pretty evenly distributed, and there are more unaffiliated, New Agers, agnostics and atheists in western states like California. Of course there are. Around a quarter of Americans have swapped from one church or faith to another, and Jehovah's Witnesses have the worst retention rate. Just 37% raised in the church stay there as adults. 46% of Americans believe in pure creationism. Another 32% say that humans evolved under God's guidance. And just 15% believe that we evolved without God having anything to do with it. The rest have no opinion, which in itself is pretty unusual for Americans. And while just 7% of Americans say Elvis is still alive and 30% say that aliens are real, a full 80% of Americans believe in angels.
And joining us at the roundish table this week, Dr. David Smith, lecturer in American politics at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. David Smith, welcome once again.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give us maybe a possible answer to this question that's emerged over the course of the program? So we've seen that Americans are still very religious people, and yet, as per Chaz's piece earlier, that increasingly even religious Americans are supporting gay marriage, which challenges a lot of what we thought were fundamental beliefs. What's going on?
What I would say is that to ordinary, very religious people in the United States, gay marriage has just become a far less important issue than it used to be. And there was a survey done by the American National Election Study last year that asked people what they thought the most important and least important issues facing the country were, regardless of how people felt about those issues. And gay marriage was overwhelmingly ranked as the least important issue by conservatives, meaning that they don't consider opposing gay marriage to be a very high priority anymore. This might not be true of political activists within the conservative Christian community. For a lot of them, it's still a very high priority issue, it's still a very symbolically important issue. But just for ordinary people of faith in the United States, this has ceased to be an important issue.
Do you have any theory as to why? Because back in 2004, when this was a major political issue,
yes,
there weren't actually moves to have gay marriage. Now there are. So why are they less concerned now than they were 8 years ago?
I think it was very new and frightening back then. And, I mean, in 2004, this was before, I think, any states had actually managed to make it legal. Now several states have had it legal for a while. I think that the longer that this issue has been around, the less alarming it's actually become to religious people, even if they're, still against it. They just don't think it's worth fighting for.
Could there be a
anymore.
similar disconnect? Because you're talking a lot last year about contraception and the fact that
Yes.
Catholics are using contraception even though their church says don't. Is there a similar disconnect between lived experience and church doctrine that people are happy to deprioritise it as a result of that?
That's right. I mean, I think that for a lot of people, this thing has actually been around for a while now. It hasn't affected them in any way. They just don't see it as something that is that's worth picking battles over. For very religious people, there are still much more important issues out there. I mean, we have not seen a decline in the importance of abortion as an issue.
And would you say that Obama's conversion last year helped it along, or did he just jump on the train that had already left the station?
I think a bit of both. He was certainly getting on it fairly late as far as the progressive side of politics went. But certainly a lot of people who don't pay very close attention to politics or political issues issues and might not have very strong opinions. That might have been just the sort of cue they needed to think it's okay now. It's nothing really to worry about.
The sequester. This was something that we were talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks in the build-up to all of this. Was it going to be a fiscal cliff, debt ceiling, crisis, tax-mageddon thing, or was it going to have no impact at all? After a few weeks now, can we say it's been a bit of a fizz, or is it having an effect?
It's having an effect for anyone who is getting stuck at airports in the United States and finding dramatically reduced budgets there actually having an effect. Not having much of an economic effect yet. And economists did say that it would be a very slow cumulative effect, the sequester. But it would be fair to say most Americans probably wouldn't have seen much of an economic effect of the sequester yet at all, apart from people who are, potentially facing redundancy.
I suppose also that part of it is that the people who it would affect would probably be poor people, in terms of payments. And as we all know in America, the poor people tend to get completely ignored as far as politics goes. So,
yes, they're the least mobilised, the least coordinated politically, and they're also a group of people that the Republican Party likes to ignore and the Democratic Party can afford to ignore because they know they'll be voting Democratic.
On a slightly different economic issue, connected to the sequester, the payroll tax went up a few months ago now.
That's right, yes.
And I remember at the time, unlike the sequester, a lot of economists were saying this is going to be big. This will actually kill the economy. And it's just gone up since then. What's your theory about what's going on there?
There's a couple of things going on here because the payroll tax was the centrepiece of the stimulus. I mean, even more than spending, that was supposed to be the thing that actually jogged the economy along. And it had very mixed results in the first place in actually achieving that. One thing that we were talking about earlier, which is this poll that says 48% of Americans don't actually realise that the payroll tax has been put up again.
This is what we do during the breaks. We talk about polls.
That's right, because mutual shared interest, the only one that we have. And the economic theory motivating this stimulus, this Keynesian stimulus, is that you're manipulating people's expectations. So if they think they're going to have more money or less money, that's going to affect the way that they spend and interact with the economy. Now, if people don't even know that they have less money, then that hasn't affected the way that they've behaved at all, so it hasn't affected the economy.
Can we touch a bit on foreign policy before we let you go? Last week we were talking about President Obama's first trip to Israel as president, and to the region, of course. There's a bit of talk about Syria as well, and Iran too. Are you discerning any shift in US policy? Those reports of maybe chemical weapons being used in Syria, this could lead to an intervention?
I'm not discerning any shift from the administration yet, and I'll defer to a political journalist called Charles Pierce, who said that what America needs right now is Vietnam syndrome, or what America needs right now is Iraq syndrome. That is, we are still in 10 years after the Iraq War. People still remember what happened the last time the United States undertook a military action because of rumours of weapons of mass destruction. And so even though there are people beating the war drums again, saying that Syria's use of chemical weapons would justify much more military aid, much more military action, the administration really doesn't seem to want to go near it.
I'm just thinking 10 years after Vietnam, the US bombed Lebanon. So, anything's possible, I suppose.
That's right, yeah. And, possibly the Iraq War happened because Vietnam had been so forgotten by that point. People did not remember what happened last time the United States went to somewhere that was kind of peripheral to its interests, where there was a very aroused and angry population that knew the terrain that the United States didn't, where there was the probability of an insurgency, even though the conventional army could be defeated.
Yeah. Well, David Smith, it's always great to see you here at the Roundish table. Thank you very much for joining us this week.
My pleasure.